You are so beautiful. Meanwhile, at Hays, the next Thanksgiving, 416 days later, 700 washing ups later, the next morning, 3 seconds later, 55 months later, 88 times on a roller coaster later, 1 billion millions later. 72 open presents later, 100 shoppings later, 666 late cheese a lot later, 916 years later.
Huh?
Shut up.
5 weeks later,
77 minutes later,
666 deaths later,
90 farm animals later, 7 million subscribers later, 22 hours later, 2:33 p.m., 375 workings later, many seconds later, 300 phones later, a ton of 6-7 later, like this tweets later, 80 swear words later. The first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, 30 disco days later, after dance, 30 disco days later, after dance, again, 200 million centuries later.
Oh my God!
That was the biggest time card ever. 3 trips on holidays later. Many sodas later, 106 games later, Usain waves later, a few decamelingians later.
Huh?
How did I just told you 2 times, 22 climbing mountains later, 706 internets later, 33 minutes later, 44 straws later.
so much later that we only got to take money and send to jail. Then we got waiting for him to get back home. And there are more people. And you...
18 days of playtime later, the next winter, meanwhile.
780 violin songs later.
Would you please stop interrupting me? It's starting very annoying. 120 hours later, 692 detentions later,
886 days later,
8 seconds later, 110 minutes later,
81 gave out songs later.
5 very boring minutes later, approximately 15 hours later, 768 years later.
huh?
That was 3 times. Go away. 111 days later, the next bonfire night.
60 sports later.
97,104 blocks later, 400 meters later, 30 billion breakings of glass later, 67 days later,
2 movies later,
70,000 jumping jacks later, 21 days later. 21 days is 3 weeks, and 504 hours later that night music, 5 million fireworks later, 10,000 explosions later.
The next Halloween.
787 fails later, 102 pumpkin faces later, 10 m, 1 trillion seconds later, 64 years later, 20 million balloons later, 10 years later, 100 watching videos later, 271 sprunty ox later, 384 sickly 4 hours later, millions of dollars later, 56 sad songs later, 700 semesters later, many more happy birthdays later, 333 escaping jails later, 4 days later, 50 decillion items later, a ton of uses to with you fancies of Jejuic usage later, repine, 811,118 wishes later, am not an expert, 366 days later, 880 years later, after when he's died. It will turn into a zombie, 25 seconds later, 3 minutes later, many hours later, 9 months later, 199 months later, 60 years later, 889 months later, 8 quadrillion, 920, 29, 26, 26,521 millenniums later. Much later. So much later. Boring. Bro.